So welcome to our event tonight, American Chameleon, Wyatt Earp's Life of Reinvention with Andrew C. Isenberg. And I'm just gonna go over a couple things here with the Arizona Historical Society. So today, the staff that you have on this call are Dr. David Turpey. He is Vice President of Exhibitions, Education, and Publications, and is also the editor of the Journal of Arizona History. And myself, I am Vanessa Fajardo. I am a museum curator at the Arizona History Museum in Tucson. So I work with exhibitions as well as collections. Some helpful reminders is if you could please use the chat box for any comments or questions. We will go ahead and get those answered for you at the end. Because of the number of participants, we have about 111 of you signed up for this. We encourage you to please keep your video off and remain mute for the duration of the program. And then this program is recorded, just as a reminder. A link for this will be put up and it's going to go on our YouTube channel, and we're going to send out a survey to all of you. And if you enjoy this program, please consider becoming a member of the Arizona Historical Society, and you can do that at azhs.gov or .org, /membership. For Arizona Historical Society, we want to be able to connect people through the power of Arizona's history. We are all Arizonans, whether you are, here or if you're outside of the state too. History and everything that we're doing is what connects us. We have 4 locations. We have one in Flagstaff, Yuma, Tempe, and Tucson. And we were established in 1864. We collect, preserve, and tell the story of Arizona's past through museum exhibitions, libraries and archives, historic sites, educational programs, and the Journal of Arizona History. Ways to stay connected: you can become a member, you can sign up for our email list, follow us on social media on our Facebook and Instagram pages, as well as our Twitter account, and you can order a license plate to help support us. And you can do all of these things at azhs.org. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and kick it off to David. And then that way you can go ahead and get started.
Great, thank you, Vanessa, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for this virtual program from the Arizona Historical Society. I am David Turpey, and on behalf of the Arizona Historical Society, I am very pleased to introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Andrew C. Isenberg is the Hall Distinguished Professor of American History at the University of Kansas. His research and teaching focus on environmental history, Native American history, the history of the North American West, and borderlands history. Dr. Isenberg has published dozens of articles and book chapters, has been the editor of 3 books, and has authored 4 books, including his 2013 book, Wyatt Earp, A Vigilante Life, which I have to say is one of my favorite books. As we approach the 140th anniversary of the shootout at the OK Corral next week, we at the Arizona Historical Society are honored to have Dr. Isenberg here with us tonight for his talk, American Chameleon, Wyatt Earp's Life of Reinvention. Welcome, Dr. Isenberg.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David and Vanessa, for that really very kind introduction, and also for giving me the opportunity to give this talk at virtually in any sense, at the Arizona Historical Society. I did a lot of my research for this book at the Arizona Historical Society, so it's nice to at least virtually be back. I hope everyone can see that the PowerPoint presentation that I'm sharing. Assuming that you can, I'm just going to begin. So on the night of March 20th, 1882, at a train station in Tucson, Arizona, Wyatt Earp, who was at the time a deputy United States Marshal, killed Frank Stillwell, who was an accused stage robber and murderer. So Earp was a law officer at the time, but this killing was a summary execution. Earp fired his shotgun into Stillwell's chest at such close range that powder burns encircled the wound. There were 4 members of Earp's posse, and that posse included his best friend, the ex-dentist and gambler, Doc Holliday, and they all opened fire with their own weapons. When a railroad worker discovered Stillwell's body the next morning, it bore multiple shotgun and bullet wounds, but Stillwell's own pistol had not been fired. The city of Tucson has erected statues of Earp and Holliday at the train station, a relatively rare instance of statuary to commemorate what was really a vigilante killing. And this is not to imply that Stillwell was any kind of angel. Earp and his posse killed Stillwell in retaliation for the killing of Wyatt's younger brother, Morgan, 2 nights earlier in Tombstone. Witnesses had identified Stillwell as one of Morgan's killers. The killing of Morgan, like the shooting of Wyatt's older brother, Virgil, in late December 1881, those shootings were in retaliation for the 3 Earp brothers and Holliday, all acting as city law officers, killing 3 cowboys in Tombstone in October 1881, the infamous, if ill-named, gunfight at the OK Corral. Ill-named because the gunfight actually happened in an empty lot behind the corral. On the site of that gunfight in Tombstone, you will find 8 animatronic figures who at the press of a button will reenact the gunfight for you, their arms raised somewhat arthritically from their sides, and they point guns at each other, and you hear recorded voices and gunshots. So why did that gunfight happen? Wyatt's older brother, Virgil, was the town marshal. Wyatt, his younger brother, Morgan, and his friend, Doc Holliday, were deputies. They confronted 4 cowboys in the empty lot. They ordered them to surrender their weapons. Contrary to popular belief, in the 19th century West, people did not tote their pistols everywhere. In fact, in Tombstone, it was forbidden for anyone except a police officer to carry a weapon within the city. There was a similar law in Dodge City when Wyatt Earp was on the police force there. If you can read what's on that sign in the foreground, it says the carrying of firearms is prohibited within the city. The added intrigue to the gunfight was this: Wyatt Earp very much wanted to be elected county sheriff. It was a lucrative position because the sheriff also collected all the taxes in the town, or in the county, and he was entitled to keep a percentage of the taxes he collected as his fee. And there was one primary landholder in the county, and that was the Southern Pacific Railroad. So collecting taxes was one-stop shopping. And the sheriff's percentage would amount to about $30,000 a year, which was an enormous amount in 1881. So to be elected sheriff, Earp thought that catching some local stage robbers would help him win the election. Everyone knew who the robbers were. The trick was catching them. So Earp had intrigued with some local cowboys, the Clanton brothers and the McLaury brothers, to lure those stage robbers to the Clanton ranch, and there Earp could arrest them. The cowboys could keep the reward money, Earp would get the credit, and he thought that would get him elected sheriff. But the scheme fell apart. One of the Clantons came to believe that Earp had revealed the conspiracy, and the gunfight resulted. So the gunfight was not between police officers and hardened criminals. The gunfight was between police officers and their disaffected informants. At any rate, 3 of the cowboys were killed and 1 ran away. Virgil and Morgan were wounded but survived. So in the movies, the credits usually roll more or less at that point. And as you can see a gunfight at the OK Corral on top with Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas, Tombstone with Kurt Russell and Val Kilmer in the middle, and Hour of the Gun with James Garner as Earp and Jason Robards as Holliday, which actually begins with the gunfight rather than ends with it. So it's unusual in that respect. But what really happened after the gunfight is that the city council relieved Virgil of his duties as marshal, and the 3 Earps and Holliday were brought to court. They endured a month-long hearing, a coroner's inquest, to determine if there was enough evidence to put the 4 men on trial for murder. And when he was not in the courtroom, Wyatt Earp, along with Doc Holliday, spent much of that month in a jail cell in Tombstone. Now, at that hearing, if the cowboys had managed to stick to one story, or if they'd been willing to press for manslaughter rather than murder, the Earps and Holliday might well have gone to trial and been convicted. But the Earps presented a disciplined defense. Wyatt Earp took advantage of a territorial law that allowed a defendant to read a prepared statement in a hearing and not submit to cross-examination. And the judge ruled that there was insufficient evidence to go to trial. So the cowboys concluded that you couldn't get justice in a courtroom. And this is the Tombstone courtroom. This is not the one where the hearing happened. This court was not built until 1882. So since the cowboys concluded they could not get justice in the courtroom, they took out their frustrations by shotgunning Virgil Earp in late December, crippling him. And Wyatt, by then a deputy federal marshal, arrested the alleged shooter, who was the lone survivor of the gunfight, but his friends provided him with an alibi in court. Most likely they perjured himself. So when Stillwell and other cowboys took revenge again on the Earps by killing Morgan in March 1882, here's how the feud stood. Men on both sides wore badges. The Earps were federal marshals. The cowboys controlled the sheriff's office in Cochise County. Both sides had tried and failed to persecute their enemies in court or to prosecute their enemies in court. And that failure on Earp's side is usually presented as justification for Earp killing Stillwell in Tucson. If he had arrested Stillwell and brought him to court, Stillwell's friends probably would have perjured themselves and given him an alibi. But we have to point out that the cowboys too felt that they had not been able to bring the Earps to justice in court, and they similarly felt justified in resorting to extra-legal violence. But the extra-legal violence on Earp's part became part of his iconography. When your enemy is truly evil and the law is too high-minded or too scrupulous of legal procedure, and thus too weak to punish the evil, then the good lawman must break the law to defeat him. And a host of books, films, television programs propelled Earp into his status as this popular icon of the vigilante lawman. Publication in 1931 of the first Earp biography by Stuart Lake, Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal, was followed in 1932 by the first Earp film, Law and Order, starring Walter Houston. And in the 1930s, in both the Lake biography and the Houston film, Earp was seen as a kind of model for the FBI's battle against organized crime. He was sort of an Elliot Ness of the Old West. And during the early years of the Cold War, the Earp icon of the resolute lawman became a symbol of resistance to communism. And both in fighting organized crime in the 1930s and in fighting communism in the 1950s, the lesson of Earp was the same. Sometimes a lawman has to break the law to fight crime. And those echoes were, I think, loud and clear in Maricopa County in recent years, where the former sheriff, Joe Arpaio's immigration posse interdicted suspected illegal Mexican immigrants because they looked like they were Mexican. And the posse included among its members a Phoenix man named Wyatt Earp, who is not only the namesake of the 1880s lawman, but claims to be his nephew as well, and in fact had a small role in a 1993 Wyatt Earp film. And I think the Earp ethic informs the National Rifle Association's opposition to gun safety laws. Wayne LaPierre, the NRA executive vice president for the past 30 years, has famously said, the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. So my point is, for 75 years, Americans in public and private life have invoked the Earp icon of the vigilante to rationalize the extra-legal pursuit of justice. So Earp has been memorialized in statues and memorialized in film. He's been employed to justify extra-legal killing at several points over the last decades. So who was he, and how did this version of him come to be the way we remember him? I'm going to try to persuade you tonight that the real Earp was very different from the Earp of popular culture. The real Earp was a gambler, a con man, a horse thief, a brothel bouncer who eventually graduated to vigilante murder. The reason we remember him otherwise is that he was also a very skilled storyteller. He told stories about himself that put his life in a very different light. In short, he reinvented his worst crimes, the killing of Stillwell and at least one other man in retaliation for his brother's murder. He reinvented those as acts of high justice. So the bare outline of Earp's life goes like this. He was born in 1848 in Monmouth, Illinois, His father, Nicholas, had migrated to Illinois from Kentucky. For a few years, the family moved from Illinois to Pella, Iowa, and then back to Monmouth, and then back to Pella. In 1864, the Earps migrated to San Bernardino, California. After the Civil War, Virgil Earp, Wyatt's older brother, took Wyatt along as a freighter in the West, and then Wyatt joined up with his father in Lamar, Missouri in 1870, and there Wyatt served on the local police force. He was arrested for horse theft in Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma, in 1871. He was arrested for consorting with prostitutes 3 times in Peoria, Illinois in 1872. In 1874, he found his way to Wichita, where he worked as a bouncer at a brothel run by his brother. Eventually, he became a police officer there. In 1876, he moved on to Dodge City, and in 1879, he went to Tombstone. After Tombstone, he bounced around several mining towns in Colorado and Idaho before settling in San Diego, where he and Virgil owned saloons and gambling halls, speculated in real estate, and Wyatt took up promoting boxing and horse racing. He lived out the last 30 years of his life. He died in 1929 in Southern California, splitting time between a primitive shack in the Colorado, or on the Colorado River in the desert, and a rented 1-room apartment in Los Angeles. And in those last years of his life, really, for the last 15 years specifically, he devoted that time to reinventing his past. In 1914, he began visiting Hollywood studios and pitching filmmakers with the idea of making a film of his life. He dictated his memoirs around 1918 to a woman named Forestine Hooker, who was the author of children's stories about the West. And then again, he started over and told his stories again to another would-be biographer, a man named John Flood, who was a friend of his. Both of those memoirs were never published. Forestine Hooker's because Wyatt was dissatisfied with it, and John Flood's because it was so poorly written that it was rejected by a bunch of publishing houses. And then a few months before his death, Wyatt agreed to work with Stuart Lake, and Lake eventually published that biography. So we all, to some extent, tell stories about ourselves that tend to show us in the most favorable light. Wyatt's reinventions went further than that, though. Editing his past was something that he started doing long before he went to Hollywood or reminiscing to biographers. For instance, in the early 1870s, he told his sister that he was hunting bison in the Southern Plains, when in fact, he was being arrested for horse theft in Indian Territory and for consorting with prostitutes in Illinois. After killing Stillwell and at least one other man he suspected of involvement with his brother's death, he fled Arizona under indictment for murder himself, found himself briefly in a silver boomtown in Idaho. He told a man he met there that he and his brothers had been cattle kings in Arizona, but had suffered, and I'm quoting him, reverses of fortune and the crowding in of sheepmen. So he could reinvent himself with ease in the 1870s and 1880s because the United States in that time was a narrowly localized society. The historian Robert Wiebe has famously described the United States at that time as a nation of island communities. In that kind of world, Earp could pull up stakes, move to a new town, and remake his reputation. He could outrun his past. So to biographers and would-be biographers, Earp did not mention that from about the year 1876 on, he made his living primarily as a gambler by dealing a game called Pharaoh. To put it bluntly, he was a lifelong professional gambler. He was only briefly an amateur law officer. So the rules of Pharaoh are simple. There's a layout, usually made of green felt, on which 13 cards of a standard deck are printed. Players bet on one or more of the 13 the way you would place a bet as if you were shooting dice. The dealer turns over a pair of cards. Winners pay players who have bet on that card. If the losing card turns up, then the dealer collects your bet if you've bet on that card. At the end of the play, there are 3 cards left in the deck. Note the resemblance to 3-card Monte, and the players bet on the order in which the 3 cards will appear. So the odds only barely favor the dealer, which is why a person who could make a living dealing Pharaoh was almost by definition a card cheat. Dealers used decks in which the edges of the cards had been shaved slightly, And an experienced dealer could feel the slight differences in the sizes of the cards, and through sleight of hand could ensure that he turned over winners and losers in an order that would benefit him. But sleight of hand was not enough. To cheat effectively, a dealer had to be a good psychologist. Most players would habitually bet on a certain card to win, so a successful dealer would let that player win on that card at least once per shuffle, and the dealer would win the other 3 times in order to keep him at the table. And dealers also cultivated an air of detachment and imperturbability. And that coolness was a facade. It created an air of detached honesty, even as the dealer was cheating the players. So the coolness and poise which contemporaries saw in Wyatt Earp was, I suggest, not a trait he developed as a police officer as much as a Pharaoh dealer. In fact, his stints as a police officer, altogether, if you add up all his time as a police officer, less than 5 years of his life, and never for more than a year at a time. They should also be understood in large part as extensions of his work as a gambler. Pharaoh dealers in cow towns and mining camps worked as teams. One man dealt the cards, another one watched the table to collect the bets, one or more stood guard to shoo away competing gambling fraternities. And it was useful for these gambling fraternities to elevate one or more of their members onto the local police force. So Earp belonged to one of these gambling fraternities. It was called the Easterners because they came from Kansas, as opposed to the Slopers who came from California. And he's pictured here with other Easterners, Bat Masterson, Luke Short, Charlie Bassett, all of whom were professional gamblers and all of whom also served from time to time as police officers. And the boundary between a Pharaoh dealer and a confidence man was blurry. Like dealers of 3-card Monte, Pharaoh dealers often worked with an accomplice posing as a player, and that accomplice would amble up to the table, loudly place a few bets and win easily, and then draw real players to the table. And Earp, like a lot of other Pharaoh dealers, drifted over into other kinds of confidence games. In the course of my research, I stumbled onto 3 incidents, one in Texas in 1878, one in Colorado in 1883, and one in California in 1895, from 3 independent sources who were unlikely to know of each other, in which Earp was accused of running the same confidence game. That is, he sold them an ordinary rock that he'd painted yellow, and he claimed it was a gold nugget. When he was a police officer, Earp could play the part of an upright lawman convincingly. He was the grandson of a Methodist deacon, and the upright church-going citizens of Dodge City, who lived on the north side of town and were doctors and lawyers and merchants, approved of the fact that Wyatt was not a drinker. They once presented him with a pocket New Testament inscribed, "To Wyatt Earp, as slight recognition of his many Christian virtues and steady following in the footsteps of the meek and lowly Jesus." But that was just a role that Earp was playing. He was never willing to sacrifice gambling, prostitutes, confidence games, or petty crime to become a lawman completely. And I'll also say he never reformed. He was arrested by the Los Angeles Police's Bunko Squad in 1911 when he was 63 years old for running a crooked Pharaoh game, which means effectively he was running a Pharaoh game since they were always crooked. So I'll say that self-invention has a long history in America. In the 18th and 19th century, self-invention was closely related to the powerful American beliefs in moral betterment and upward social mobility. Benjamin Franklin is the prototype for that kind of reinvention, a self-made man who rose to wealth and prominence through hard work and virtuous self-denial. And there's a similar case in the 19th century of Horatio Alger, who's an ex-divinity student who wrote a series of novels for children that became he was the herald of the American rags to riches story. And Franklin and Alger paved the way for a kind of American therapeutic self-help culture where we're all going to make ourselves better by virtuous self-denial and self-awareness. But Wyatt's version of self-invention differed from Franklin and Alger. Socially, his family was downwardly mobile, not upwardly mobile like Alger or Franklin. And this, by the way, purports to be a picture of Wyatt Earp with his mother. I'm not convinced necessarily of its authenticity, but I thought I would show it to you anyway so you get a sense of what people think he might have looked like. He had been born in Illinois in 1848 to an extended family of migrants from Kentucky. In Illinois, the Earps were local officials. Wyatt's grandfather was a justice of the peace. Two of his uncles were town constables. And they used their office for private gain. One of the Earps would buy at below face value promissory notes of debtors who were unable to pay their debts, then would file suit to compel this debtor to pay the debt at its full value. Constable Earp would arrest the debtor, deliver him into the court of justice of the peace Earp, who would order the defendant to pay the debt to another Earp, as well as court costs. The German sociologist Max Weber called this booty politics. And Wyatt spent his childhood moving from one rented farm to another. His father, Nicholas, and this is Nicholas Earp and his wife, he was disappointed in his adulthood by a series of financial and legal setbacks, and he pointedly abandoned the idea of working his way up the social ladder. Instead, he became a whiskey dealer. By the time Wyatt was in his teens, his father had become an inveterate liar who invented for himself the achievements that had eluded him in life. So Nicholas Earp, for instance, claimed to have fought in the Black Hawk War in Illinois, when in fact he was living in Kentucky at the time. He also claimed that he was a scout for Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone died when Nicholas Earp was 7 years old. So like his father, Wyatt Earp embraced this idea of self-invention, and like his father, he had no interest in the self-denial that would mean upward social mobility. So unlike those paragons of reinvention like Ben Franklin or even Abraham Lincoln, who strived to invent a better future for themselves, Wyatt simply invented a better past. So Wyatt Earp briefly became a celebrity following the Tombstone gunfight and the vigilante killings after that. But by the mid-1880s, he had faded from the spotlight. And following his flight from Arizona, he just moved from one mining camp to another. He dealt cards, he managed brothels. He eventually moved to California, where he promoted boxing matches and trained horse races. Boxing and horse racing were the two most popular spectator sports in America in the late 19th century, and both were deeply enmeshed with gambling. And Wyatt's connection with boxing led him to be selected in 1896 to referee a heavyweight championship bout in San Francisco. And the bout was undoubtedly fixed. Wyatt, who called a foul on the favorite for an alleged low blow below the belt, was central to the fix. And in the wake of the fight, newspapers asked, who is this, at that point, largely unknown man? And they dredged up stories of his vigilantism in Arizona. He was reviled in the papers as a violent man. And people he cheated, like people to whom he'd sold rocks painted gold, came forward and accused him of being a liar. So suddenly a celebrity, Wyatt found himself unable to reinvent himself. He was defined in the public mind as a scoundrel. America, by the 1890s and the early 20th century, was no longer a nation of island communities. By that time, a national media culture had emerged. And so Wyatt Earp, who continued to move around, found that his reputation as a gunman and a con man preceded him wherever he went. So Wyatt went into a kind of hiding. He fled to faraway mining camps. He spent 2 years running a saloon in Nome, Alaska, trying to escape his unwanted celebrity. He deeply resented the national media culture that had emerged at the end of the 19th century that made it impossible for him to reinvent himself with the freedom that he once had. This is Wyatt pictured at his camp that he had in the California desert on the Colorado River. So two things happened to Wyatt Earp that caused him to emerge from his self-imposed exile and that gave us the popular icon that still endures. First, in the first decade of the 20th century, Wyatt's brother-in-law gave him a gift. The gift was a copy of Owen Wister's popular 1901 novel, The Virginian. The Virginian went through 15 printings in its first 8 months. It became a popular stage drama. And then in 1914, it was made into a film. So we don't know if Wyatt read the book. I don't know how much of a reader he was, but he could not have failed to have heard about the story because it was everywhere in the early 20th century. And beyond its general popularity, the Virginian probably made a special appeal to Wyatt because Wyatt could see himself, or rather an ideal version of himself, in the hero. In Owen Wister's Hero, Wyatt could see himself as he wished to be, a child of the backcountry who had risen to dominance in the cutthroat world of the cow towns and the mining camps. And this made him not a Western bad man, as some newspapers had characterized him after 1896, but a kind of natural aristocrat. So notably, in the novel, the Virginian fights a public gun battle, as Wyatt did, and the Virginian must resort to vigilante justice against cattle thieves, as Wyatt had become a vigilante. And most importantly, vigilantism in the novel is presented not as an impulsive act of vengeance, but as sober justice. And so here was the legitimation for his vigilante killings that had long eluded Wyatt. He had avoided talking about those vigilante killings until after 1901. After the Virginian was published, he starts presenting his acts of vigilantism as a form of justice. So the second thing that happened is that in the 1910s, Earp found himself living only a few miles from Hollywood. In 1914, when Paramount Pictures made a film version of The Virginian, Wyatt Earp made his first visit to a Los Angeles film studio. He charmed Raoul Walsh and Charlie Chaplin with tales of his past. And soon Wyatt established himself as a kind of informal advisor on Western films. The director Alan Dwan gave him a walk-on role in a 1916 Douglas Fairbanks Western. In 1923, Wyatt's best friend from the studios, the Western film actor William S. Hart, created a Wyatt Earp character for his film Wild Bill Hickok. So Wyatt's familiarity with Hollywood convinced him to try to use this new media to his advantage, defining himself the way he wanted to be remembered. So he wrote a letter to Hart in 1923. Many wrong impressions of the early days of Tombstone and myself have been created. I'm not going to live to the age of Methuselah, and any wrong impression I want to make right before I go away. The screen could do all this. And Wyatt believed that Hart might be, as he called him, the mastermind of a film of Wyatt's adventures. Or maybe Hart, who was already in his 60s, would produce or direct, and a younger cowboy actor such as Tom Mix, whom Wyatt had also befriended, might star. And Hart encouraged Earp to put his reminiscences into print as a prelude to a film, either a book or maybe a series of articles in a publication like the Saturday Evening Post. So Earp became consumed in the last years of his life with telling his story and justifying his resort to deadly violence in Arizona. And so he told and retold stories of his life as a law officer. And his identity had always been plastic. He had always been reinventing himself. He had always had a penchant for reinvention. And in the last years of his life, this freely lent itself to Hollywood myth-making. Eventually, Hollywood vindicated the vigilante, and they adopted Wyatt's tales and made him into an icon of law and order. So the trick was finessing his vigilantism, not as lawlessness, but as a higher law. And toward this end, Wyatt Earp, as he told stories of his life, took pains to present himself as a lifelong proponent of law and order and as a principled opponent of vigilantism who only resorted to it as a last resort. So I'm going to give you 3 examples of the way in which Wyatt Earp tweaked his reminiscences in the last years of his life. Firstly, consider something as simple as Wyatt's explanation for how he came to Tombstone from Dodge City in 1879. In 1896, Wyatt told a reporter for the San Francisco Examiner that he left Dodge City because, and I'm quoting him, "I was tired of a peace officer's life and wanted no more of it," end quote. And he also went on to say that on his way to Tombstone, he met the US Marshal for the Arizona Territory, and that man prevailed upon him to accept a commission as a deputy US Marshal. So that's what he said in 1896. This account is patently false. On the way to Tombstone, it was not Wyatt, but his brother Virgil, who was appointed a deputy US Marshal. So 20 years after this interview with the reporter for the Examiner, Wyatt Earp told his would-be biographer, Forrestine Hooker, that he entered Tombstone wearing a badge, not that of a deputy US Marshal, but as a deputy sheriff of Pima County. The story is suspiciously similar. Stopping in Tucson on the way to Tombstone, the sheriff of Pima County convinced the reluctant Wyatt to be his deputy. This account is also false. Wyatt eventually became a deputy county sheriff, but not until July 1880. And when he reminisced to another would-be biographer, John Flood, in the mid-1920s, Wyatt repeated the story he told Hooker, but this time he told Flood that he had declined the offer of the badge. Not long after that, he returned to the version he told Hooker, saying that he held the appointment as a deputy county sheriff. He told this because he was called to give a deposition in an inheritance case, and he was asked how it was he came to Tombstone. So these shifting falsehoods are revealing. In claiming to have entered Tombstone as either a deputy federal marshal or as a deputy county sheriff, Wyatt intuited the requirements of popular culture well enough to realize that if he hoped to vindicate his resort to vigilante violence, he needed to present himself as having been always on the side of the law. The truth is, he came to Tombstone to deal Pharaoh, which is a fact he later admitted in this 1926 deposition that he gave. But that would have undercut the persona he was creating of a stalwart lawman. So throughout his reminiscences, he downplayed or erased gambling. So Wyatt spun another tale about his time in Tombstone, and this is in fact a picture of Tombstone, as was the previous slide. And this story that he told was intended to deflect criticism about vigilante killings. He told all his biographers that in early 1881, he faced down a crowd of men intent on lynching a gambler named Johnny O'Rourke. According to his biographers, O'Rourke killed a mining engineer outside of Tombstone, then fled to Tombstone with a lynch mob in pursuit. Upon reaching Tombstone, this man, O'Rourke, surrendered to Wyatt, who shut O'Rourke into a bowling alley, and then Wyatt stepped out into the street alone, armed with a shotgun, to face down a mob that had grown to 400. Forrestine Hooker wrote in her unpublished biography, "Guilty or not guilty, Wyatt Earp knew his duty was to protect the man who was his prisoner. Unwilling to confront the crowd, or to confront Wyatt Earp, the crowd disperses." And Flood tells a remarkably similar version. So Johnny O'Rourke did kill a mining engineer, did flee to Tombstone ahead of a pursuing mob, did surrender to a lawman in a bowling alley in January 1881, but the lawman was not Wyatt Earp. According to the local newspaper, the lawman was the newly elected city marshal, Ben Sippy. In fact, Wyatt was not wearing a badge in January 1881. He had resigned his position as deputy sheriff in November, and he was not yet a city police officer. And according to one Tombstone resident, the crowd was not a lynch mob at all, but just locals who gathered to see what was going on. Yet Wyatt consistently told his biographers that he had faced down a mob trying to lynch O'Rourke. He cast himself as the defender of the law and an opponent of vigilantism. So finally, one last example of how Earp changed his recollections. And this is his relationship with his friend, Doc Holliday. So in places like Dodge City and Tombstone, Wyatt belonged to a world that was populated by young men, and those young men were largely engaged in a competition for status. So Wyatt lived in a male world, fellow police officers, gamblers, cowboys, and the populations of places like Dodge City and Tombstone were overwhelmingly male. This is a photograph of the Dodge City volunteer fire department. Wyatt was a member of the volunteer fire department. He's pictured in the back row on the far right. So at the same time that Wyatt Earp lived in this overwhelmingly male world, he lived at a time when family size was declining as the United States is shifting from a rural world with large families to an urban world with smaller families. And Wyatt Earp found himself in the first generation of Americans for whom marriage and sex were not simply about producing children who would comprise the family farm's workforce. Wyatt's generation of Americans was the first that began to reconceptualize of sex as an erotic rather than primarily a procreative activity. And this partly explains why Wyatt Earp and his brothers became so involved with prostitution. The emergence of 19th century non-reproductive sexuality was reflected in the increasing availability of contraception and at least the visibility of prostitution starting in the second half of the 19th century. And prostitutes populated Wyatt Earp's professional and personal life. Together with his brothers Morgan and Virgil, he worked as a brothel bouncer in Peoria, Illinois in 1872. When he first came to Wichita, Kansas in 1874, he worked as a brothel bouncer in a brothel run by his brother James. Earp told all his biographers that he was hunting bison during these years. And while prostitutes were part of his life, he looked elsewhere for friendship. While he competed with other men for status, he also found his closest friendships with other men. And this is not unusual in 19th century America, because custom at the time dictated very few opportunities for young men and women to socialize with members of the opposite sex unchaperoned. In the mining camps and the cow towns of the West, where Earp spent much of his young adulthood, this demographic imbalance between men and women heightened this gender division. So until he reached his mid-30s, Wyatt Earp lived in this world in which friendships between adults were almost exclusively between members of the same gender. So perhaps we should not be surprised that for a year, Wyatt Earp shared a bed with the man pictured on the left here, Jimmy Cairns, who was his partner on the police force in Wichita. Or that Bat Masterson referred or described Wyatt and Doc Holliday, who's pictured here on the right, as Damon and Pythias, which is using code from the 19th century to indicate that these were two men who were more than friends, but had a kind of romantic involvement. So in our day, we would assume that Earp and Cairns or Earp and Holliday must have been partners in every sense of the word. But it did not mean that in the world of the 19th century West, where close male friendships were the norm. Until the mid-1880s, Wyatt Earp reserved his closest and most emotionally intimate relationships for other men, notably his brothers, but also Cairns and later Holliday. He didn't strike up an enduring emotional relationship with a woman until he was in his mid-30s. At the same time that American society began to look with more skepticism on the kinds of same-sex friendships that had been common in the 19th century. By the time Earp dictated his memoirs in the 20th century, that world in which most adult friendships were between members of the same gender was disappearing. Young men and women were starting to socialize unchaperoned in urban Nickelodeons and in amusement parks and in dance halls. And so Earp changed his recollections of his close friendships with people like Holliday. Earp didn't mention Cairns at all in his reminiscences, and he minimized his relationship with Holliday. He described him as a one-time comrade in arms and as a member of his vigilante posse in 1882, but he also pointed out that as a member of that posse in 1882, that Holliday had fled from a gun battle in an act of cowardice, and that after that, there had been nothing between them. So how can I sum this up for you? What I want to say is that Wyatt Earp's tales were as inconsistent and changeable as his life itself. He edited out his missteps and embarrassments. He inflated his accomplishments. He appropriated the deeds of other men as his own. And he presented himself as a lawman singularly committed to justice. His prickly defense of his reputation was consistent with a kind of lifelong immersion in a culture of masculine honor. He told a story of his life in which his vigilantism was consistent with his alleged commitment to justice. Killing Stillwell and other men, in Wyatt Earp's telling, was justice for the murder of his brother. So what Wyatt Earp told was a story of the redemptive power of violence. And that story of the redemptive power of violence is one that Hollywood just sucked up and embraced. But that story was an invention. If you look at Wyatt Earp's real life, his real story is about the redemptive power of the media. Through Wyatt Earp, who died in 1929, and he didn't live to see it, but Hollywood's embrace of him as a paragon of law and order was in many ways his last and undoubtedly his greatest confidence gain, his most complete reinvention. So, screened and broadcast repeatedly, film has rooted Wyatt Earp in American collective memory. Wyatt Earp has been decontextualized through time and repetition, so his adventures, first manipulated by Wyatt Earp himself, then by actors and filmmakers, are now open to manipulation by all. It's become part of collective memory's invented tradition. And the irony to me is that the media culture that once prevented Wyatt from reinventing himself by foisting on him an unwanted celebrity became, after his death, the engine of his ongoing reinvention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. Well, we have a few questions in the chat, so we can go ahead and get started with the Q&A. And if there are other questions you have for Dr. Isenberg, please feel free to post them in the chat. And I believe we may have some questions coming in from Instagram as well that Vanessa is monitoring. So feel free to jump in anytime, Vanessa, if we have some questions. But I'll get things started with some questions from the chat. The first question here is, if we judge the man from the time in which he lived, how does he compare to his Western frontier contemporaries in terms of gambling, being a hustler, violence?
Sure. Well, certainly he was not the only gambler to populate the 19th century West. There were many gamblers, and actually gambling had a fairly high visibility in the 19th century. So he's not unique in that sense. And as I mentioned in the talk, he becomes enmeshed in boxing and horse racing, which are the two most popular spectator sports in the United States, and he's tied in with the gambling in those as well. So in that sense, Wyatt Earp is just kind of being carried along by a wave of gambling and gambling on sports in the late 19th and the early 20th century. In terms of his violence, I think the West was a less violent place than Hollywood would have us believe. And for Wyatt Earp to have been involved both in the shootings in the empty lot behind the OK Corral, which resulted in 3 people being killed, and then being involved in this posse that killed at least 2 more men, that's a little more unique. Not unique, but that puts him in a different kind of category. And I'll just say one more thing about this, in terms of comparing him to other people at the time. I've had some discussions with a colleague of mine who teaches at a university in California, Louis Warren, he's written a really good biography of Buffalo Bill. And he and I have talked about the two of them because both Buffalo Bill and Wyatt Earp told, well, they made up stories and they invented things about their past. But whereas Wyatt Earp would appropriate other people's accomplishments as his own, what Buffalo Bill tended to do was he'd put his arm around you and say, wasn't that great the time you and I went and, hunted down all those Lakota and killed them? And so he made you part of his, fabulous story. And so even though both of them were, to be blunt about it, liars, Buffalo Bill's lies, he brought everybody along with them. And whereas Earp tended to sort of appropriate other people's deeds as his own.
Great, thank you. So let me see, what's the next one is just a general comment. So I don't know if you would have a response to this or not, but I'll read it. So the comment is, this reminds me of Herman Melville's The Confidence Man, his masquerade from 1857. Melville called out the type while Wyatt Earp was still but a lad.
That is absolutely right. And I, in fact, in one of the middle chapters of the book, I spend a paragraph at least talking about Melvilles, the Confidence Man. Whoever made that comment is absolutely correct.
Great. All right, another question. Do you have a favorite version of Wyatt Earp from any of the movies?
Well, I wouldn't ever go to any of those movies for historical accuracy. So the movies, I judge them in terms of how entertaining they are. And I find most of them quite entertaining. I like My Darling Clementine because I like the way that Henry Fonda's Earp is presented as reluctantly violent. I think The Hour of the Gun with James Garner is very good. But I enjoy them as films and definitely not as history. Oh, and obviously, I like Tombstone because of Val Kilmer, who steals every scene that he's in.
Absolutely, yes. Vanessa, just to mix it up, do we have any questions from Instagram?
A lot of them are having to do with Wyatt Earp and his relationship with Doc Holliday, and then some of the ones that are already in the chat asking about his marriages and different things like that. So I know you're going to touch on a couple of those, but they're rolling in.
Well, I can see in the chat the question about Wyatt Earp being married. He did marry when he was in Missouri, and he was only there for a little over a year, a woman named Eurilla Sutherland. She died less than a year after they were married. According to Wyatt Earp's cousin who lived nearby, she died of typhoid. He never married again. When he was in Illinois, working as a brothel bouncer, there was a woman who was a prostitute at the brothel who called herself Sally Earp. And it was not uncommon for women who worked at the brothel to take on the last name of the pimp or the bouncer, because then when the police showed up, they could claim that they were married or they were a sister or they were a niece or something. Earp later on, and Sally Earp may have accompanied him to Wichita in 1874. By the time he got to Tombstone, he was in the company of a woman named Mattie Blaylock, who may also have been a former prostitute. And then for the last years of his life, he took up with a woman named Josephine Marcus, who had been, and I'm using the term that was used at the time, the concubine of the sheriff of Cochise County, John Behan. They did not formally take up together, Earp and Marcus, in Tombstone, but a couple years later. So he married once. All his other relationships, he never legally married any of these women. So, yeah.
All right, I'll jump in here. So there's a question: what are your thoughts on Wyatt Earp's account of the death and burial of Curly Bill Brochus during his vendetta ride? True or not?
Hard to say. Hard to say. Wyatt Earp does tell of essentially stumbling upon Curly Bill's camp as he was on this so-called vendetta ride. Well, it's a good name for it. And there are some things about his account that, you know, as you're reading them, you would wonder if this was made up, why he would make it up this way. For instance, Earp says that, you know, he wasn't expecting to encounter Brochus, so he had loosened his gun belt, and he was on his horse to be dismounted during the gunfight, and the gun belt was slipping down his hips, and he was trying to get back on the horse, but he couldn't. He had to pull. So he sort of presents what happened in a sort of bumbling way, which would be unusual if he were making it up. That being said, there's no other corroborating evidence for that Earp and his posse killed Brochus. And in fact, Brochus had not been seen for several months before Earp claimed to have killed him. And it could well be that Brochus had simply gotten out of Arizona because he had his own legal difficulties at the time. So that one's an open question. I will say that Earp's claim to have killed Johnny Ringo does not hold up to scrutiny, because Ringo was killed long after Earp had left Arizona.
Great, thank you. Let me see, another question. Other sources conclude that Wyatt and Doc grew apart because of Doc's anti-Semitism.
Mhm.
The commenter said, "I've never read a claim that the rift was due to Doc running from a gunfight." Where
Right.
did that source come from?
So there is, yes, that Doc Holliday. So after the second vigilante killing that we can document of Florentine Cruz, who after they killed Stilwell, they went to a wood cutting camp and the posse killed Florentine Cruz. And then there were warrants out for the arrest of Earp and the rest of the posse, so they fled to Arizona. And there, according to some accounts, which I think are credible, Holliday made an off-color remark to Earp about Josephine Marcus, who was Jewish, and Earp didn't take to this very nicely. That being said, Earp and Holliday stayed together for the next year. They both wound up in Gunnison, Colorado. And so the rift couldn't have been too much. So I don't think that there was a rift, to be honest. I think that by that time, Wyatt Earp knew what kind of person Doc Holliday was. Doc Holliday was from Georgia. Holliday was very critical of his own father's politics because after the Civil War, Doc Holliday's father became a Southern white man who was cooperating with Republican authorities and cooperating with the Freedmen's Bureau, which Doc Holliday's father worked for. And the purpose of the Freedmen's Bureau was to resettle and adjust newly freed slaves to life and freedom. And Doc Holliday was critical of all of that. And so I'm sure that Wyatt Earp knew that. And so the fact that Doc Holliday would make an off-color remark about Josephine Marcus's being Jewish, probably not surprising. I don't know that it came between them necessarily. I think they understood that about him. I think what I'm trying to suggest, or suggested in the talk, it is true that in the biography that he dictated to John Flood, Wyatt Earp depicted Doc Holliday as a man who fled from that, literally from the battle with Curly-Bill Brochus. Earp says that Holliday turned around and ran away from that fight, and says in that biography, after that, there was nothing between us. And that biography was never published, which is why the questioner may never have heard of it. But this is another way in which Wyatt Earp was trying to edit his life and try to present his life in the 19-teens and 1920s to an audience then that would find it acceptable. And Earp at that time thought the thing to do was to minimize his relationship with Holliday. And Earp sometimes would try one way of editing his life, and then he'd talk to a different biographer and he'd try another way and have a completely different story. So he wasn't consistent about this. I see a question. I actually would like the opportunity to answer one of the questions that I see in the chat. Was Wyatt Earp relatively wealthy late in his life, or did he die relatively poor? And this is an easy one to answer because yes, he died relatively poor. He did not have a lot of money at the end of his life. This is very different from the way his first biographer, Stuart Lake, presented him. He said that Wyatt Earp had all sorts of mining claims and investments and lived the life of a prosperous businessman, was the way Stuart Lake put it. Nothing could be further from the truth. He lived in this primitive shack in the desert and then rented a one-room apartment that he and his, not wife, but partner shared in Los Angeles. Yeah, he didn't have money at the end of his life.
This is a great question, I think. What first prompted you to delve into the life of Wyatt Earp?
So I had been teaching the history of the American West for a while, and I came up with a Wyatt Earp lecture because it was an opportunity. This was in the 90s, and a couple of those movies had come out, and so the students were interested in it. And it was a way for me to talk about other things that were going on in the West at the time. I could talk about what mining camps were like, what the cattle towns in Kansas were like, the prevalence of prostitution and gambling. So I could talk about those social history things and kind of hook it to the life of Wyatt Earp. And then I thought, gosh, I could write a book about this. And I thought I could crank out that book quickly. But I started reading the accounts, Earp, the hunts that he gave himself, and I found that they were all at odds with each other. So I went to the Huntington Library, and there I found Earp's first biographer, Stuart Lake, had left 40 boxes of material on Wyatt Earp. Stuart Lake had been crippled in the First World War. And so he wrote his biography of Wyatt Earp by sitting at his typewriter in Southern California and banging out letters to anybody who might have known Wyatt Earp. And he kept carbon copies of his own letters, and he kept all his correspondence, and it's all there in 40 boxes. And he used only a little bit of it in writing his biography. And he had his own correspondence with Earp as well. So the more I dug into this story, well, first of all, it started taking me a long time to write this book, but the more I found that the story of Wyatt Earp was the stories that he was telling about himself, the shifting stories that he was telling about himself. And I just became fascinated with the way he kept changing his story. And I was trying to figure out why he was doing this.
Well, let me build off of that answer and sort of frame a question here that is based on a couple of questions in the chat. So do you find that people, whether it's your students in your class or people you've spoken with after publishing the book, are more attracted to the myth of Wyatt Earp than the reality of Wyatt Earp? And if so, what do you think draws people to the myth of Wyatt Earp so much?
Absolutely, people are drawn to the myth. In fact, I think there's a fair chunk of people who have seen one or more Wyatt Earp movies and don't necessarily know that there was a real Wyatt Earp. They think that Wyatt Earp is a movie character. And I think that the reason why people are drawn to the myth is simply that the myth dominates everybody's understanding. I mean, if I were to take an informal poll of everyone who is in this Zoom lecture and ask you, when and how did you first learn about Wyatt Earp? I think the answer for most people would be, well, I saw Tombstone, or I saw the Costner Wyatt Earp film, or maybe if one is a little older, it's like I saw a gunfight at the OK Corral with Burt Lancaster. Almost everybody learns about him through one of those movies. And so if you write a biography of him that's grounded in history the way I have done, what you find yourself doing is having to disassemble the Hollywood version that people have learned from the beginning. Right? People don't come to Wyatt Earp cold. They come, with a blank slate. They always come to the subject having imbibed something from the myth first.
Right, absolutely, yeah. Vanessa, any questions from Instagram?
I had a couple come in. One was asking that they had heard Wyatt Earp visited the ice cream shop every day and wanted to know if that was true.
This is true. This is true. So Tombstone had a population of about 10,000, and it was a fairly cosmopolitan place. And there was an ice cream parlor, and he liked the ice cream parlor. The other thing I should point out in that respect, this is one of the reasons why town fathers in both Tombstone or at least initially in Tombstone and in Dodge City, thought that Wyatt Earp was this upright guy, was that he was not a drinker. Unlike a lot of people at the time, he did not drink alcohol. And the reason for this, according to his sister, was that when Wyatt Earp was a teenager, his older brother, who was kind of initiating him into the ways of men, took him to a bar, gave him a drink, and Earp became violently ill. Not, worse than one would ordinarily become ill. He probably was one of those few people, and it is a real medical condition, who lacked the enzyme that allows him to break down the toxicity of alcohol. So he just didn't drink. And now this made him, in 19th century parlance, a teetotaler, which, moral authorities approved of. So this helped him in playing the part of the upright lawman.
Mm. The other question that came in is, and actually this is a question I've had too, is after the death of his first wife, is that really what set him off into this life that he lived?
I think there could be something to that. It's hard to know. There's speculation there. But after the death of his first wife, he left Lamar, Missouri, somewhat under a cloud. There was $200 missing from the public till which was money that Earp, as the town constable, had been collecting to build a town schoolhouse. And then somebody else accused him of collecting taxes and not turning it over to the city. And then within a few months, he's arrested for horse theft in Indian Territory, which is just 100 miles south of Lamar. So he could have been grieving, absolutely. If he was, though, he jumped into breaking the law pretty quickly and pretty fully.
Perfect. Yeah, that's what I have so far, David, if you want to continue with us in the chat.
Let me see. I think there's just a couple more questions. A question about where he was buried.
He was buried in a Jewish seminary in or near San Francisco. I'm not sure whether it's in or outside of San Francisco, because his last partner, not officially wife, Josephine Marcus, was Jewish. Colma, someone put it in the chat. Here we go.
Let me see. Question: did the Earps and the Clantons know each other before Tombstone?
I would have loved it if that was true, but no, they did not know each other in Southern California, although both the Earps and the Clantons were relatively poor farmers in Southern California. The Earps were in San Bernardino, the Clantons were in Santa Barbara. But the Earps and the Clantons were friendly with each other in Tombstone before the shootout. That's why Wyatt Earp could conspire with the Clantons to lure these stage robbers to their ranch. There was, a few months before Tombstone, there were some Apaches who left their reservation, and about 40 men in Tombstone formed themselves into a posse to go try and track down these Apaches, included John Behan and Virgil Earp and Wyatt Earp. And they weren't really interested in roughing it, so they stayed the night at the Clanton Ranch, their first night or second night out of Tombstone. And Virgil Earp and Wyatt Earp are palling around with the Clantons at that, and many people remarked on that who were there. And so they were all quite friendly until the shootout.
Well, I think that's all the questions I see in the chat. Vanessa, any other questions on Instagram?
Not right now. It was mostly, again, about Wyatt and Doc's relationship and asking about his marriages and if he had been married and different variations of that. So.
Okay, yeah, and lots of positive comments. Lots of somebody said great presentation, and someone said very informative and enlightening. So thank you all for the positive feedback. Let me see one. Another positive comment. So thank you all. Let me just I guess if no one else has any excuse me, nobody else has any questions, let me ask I guess the final question, which is what do you think is the most important lesson or most important lessons from his life that we can take away today?
Well, I'm not sure if that's the right question, to be honest with you, David.
Okay. All right.
That the first biography of him was presented as a story of an exemplary life. That Stuart Lake, in that first biography in 1931, did not admit any flaws in Wyatt Earp's character. He was like a perfect person from childhood all the way to the end of his life. And that was a tradition of 19th century kind of Victorian writing that Stuart Lake carried on into the early 1930s, of a kind of moral instruction. And in fact, one of the reviewers said that one of the first reviews of that book said that this book has the curious quality that it could be the script for a Western film and also could be used as a Sunday school instruction at the same time. So I just don't know that Wyatt Earp's life is one that we should look to for that kind of lesson. I think that he was a human being and he had flaws. he was very prickly about his reputation and quite willing to invent truths in order to make himself look good. He was impulsively violent. I think his impulsive violence was often in defense of his friends and his brothers, but it was still impulsive violence. And he, he Stillwell was a criminal. He wasn't brought to justice, but he was killed. The other man that he definitely killed, Florentine Cruz, may just have been a bystander. And that's the problem with vigilante justice, that you don't know necessarily that you're doing the right thing. And I think that Wyatt Earp, he cheated and conned a lot of people, and he left a lot of wreckage in his wake in that sense. And, so he's certainly not an exemplary person, but, he was a human being with some good qualities. He's certainly, for a young man from the countryside who was able to kind of make his way in a changing world, there's something admirable about that, even though he took down a lot of people along the way. But he had flaws and he had qualities.
All right. Well, thank you very much. This was really fantastic, and we really appreciate you joining us tonight for this presentation. And thanks to everyone in the audience for coming out and asking some great questions.
My pleasure.
All right. Well, I guess we'll end it here. And please, everyone in the audience, we appreciate you coming, and look out for more great virtual programs from the Arizona Historical Society. Have a good night, everyone.